know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mobs. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
Welcome to this week's United Front Radio. Because of the economic depression, we have many people coming forward with reform ideas. But most of the proposed solutions in this pile have already failed historically. Some of these proposed reforms have failed many times and are now resurfacing as, quote, the new American paradigm for work, the shift change, or workplace democracy in the Mondragon factory model that is being sold as the next great American revolution by people like Garl Perovitz, Noam Chomsky, and Richard Wolff. This mess of already tried and already failed alternatives and their leaders are even mingling together, many of whom are being heavily funded by left or right-wing billionaire-created foundations, and on the way they're congratulating each other's dead ideas as the way forward. This is all a distraction from the main issue, that Wall Street has too much power. None of them are taking aim at Wall Street. From the political campaigns of Beppe Grillo in Italy to the after-parties platform in America, is this political failure by design or just ignorance? The purpose of United Front Radio is to present models that have historically worked and take action to implement them again today. To help us unravel this mess is somebody I know to be one of our audience's living heroes and the most accurate historian of our time, Dr. Webster Tarpley. Hello, Webster.
Yes, thank you. Well, I suppose we ought to jump right in then. In order to understand why these various brand X or indeed enemy-inspired organizing methods are inadequate, they're going to fail. They are not adequate to lead humanity out of the present total social, economic, political, military crisis. The question is, what are we measuring that against? In other words, what might work? What would be a viable method of organizing people? And for this, I'm afraid the technical term is the world political working class for itself. In other words, the idea that persons of goodwill, first of all, but people who are either involved with tangible physical production or who politically support tangible physical production, modernization, progress, industry, modern agriculture, people who are interested in the possibilities of science, people who support rising standards of living, full employment, and so forth, they ought to be formed into, or form themselves, if at all possible, into a kind of a political and educational entity, which would be the class for itself. And the for itself means self-consciousness. It means self-consciousness, and since it's a class, that gets you to class consciousness, that people have to be aware of their real position in society, their life chances, the groups that oppress them, the potentialities that are being denied by the various forms of bankrupt leadership. And this is the goal. You can think of it as a philosophical school with a worldwide mass base, or a worldwide revolutionary combat party. It has that aspect too. And of course, in the historical framework that we're in, it would have to be a mobilization of these people as mass forces, political mass forces, to fight bankers, finance oligarchs, and this very, very thin layer of bankers and oligarchs who are the beneficiaries of this system. If you really do a sociological analysis of globalization, and I'm afraid the sociologists have really let us down on this, right? They don't do their work. You'd probably find that the real beneficiaries of this system, they may be in the millions, but they're certainly not more than a couple of million who really benefit from this system. And then on the other side, you've got, 7 billion or some odd that are oppressed by this, right? Denied human potential, denied the possibility of a future, upward mobility, and so forth. Now, the thing I hope is obvious from this is that this is not local. This cannot be done at the level of a neighborhood or a city or a state or a factory or even a certain industry, even across a large country. When you're talking about this stuff, it is absolutely axiomatic. You've got to be talking about big countries, not even little countries, right? You could organize the class for itself in Luxembourg, and this would get you nowhere, or Belgium, Switzerland, whatever it is, right? These places simply, they cannot influence human development in that way. And if you're some of these examples probably indicate, if you're anywhere in Europe, and this is part of my own background, anywhere in Europe, if you're not organizing European-wide, you're a loser. You're crazy. You're on a fool's errand. You look at the bankers, right? The fundamental form of bankers organization calls itself the Trilateral Commission. So that means North America, including Canada, Mexico, Japan, and other places in the Far East, and then all of Europe. So that's how they look at it, right? If that's the way they're organized, you've got to match that and indeed exceed it, right, by reaching places where they find it more difficult, right? The third world, developing countries. The basis of this is it has a history and it has an epistemological basis. It's based on class consciousness. When I say that, it doesn't mean this vulgar stuff about, the bosses are bad, although most of the time the bosses are bad, in our time anyway. The class consciousness is something that comes from Plato. You can see it in Plato's 7th book of the Politeia, right, of the Republic, where he tells you about the problems of oligarchy, the problems of tyranny, the problems of mob rule, because those are also present, right, how they often lead to tyranny. So Plato would be one important source, and then Machiavelli, and especially Machiavelli of the Discourses, where he writes about the few, right, and how the few always act to protect the few. And the problem of designing governments is to try to check this power of the few. So certainly we've come a long way, right? Since about 1310, we've had the evolution of the modern nation state, a very long period of gestation, but we have it, and it's already under heavy attack. The choice, of course, in that area is empire or nation state, and otherwise it's going to be chaos. And the democratic republic, right? The representative democracy, the U.S. Constitution. These are all big forward steps. But what we find is that it's going to take another agency. It's going to take something which is political and it's epistemological. In other words, it represents a point of view philosophically, but it also then wants to intervene in struggles, frankly, right? In the efforts of people to better their situation. So the general idea is a worldwide united front, right? We can't necessarily tell everybody, abolish the organizations you're in, forget your party, forget your union, forget your church, right? Whatever it is, or other organization. But if you're in favor of the massive increase of world economic production, especially in the form of infrastructure, if you're interested in science, you could imagine the worldwide class for itself would be a force that would contribute to planning and carrying out space exploration, to directing or influencing the course of biomedical research, right? Planning the various attacks on dreaded diseases. And then you have the other question, energy, right? High energy physics, right? Where there's something in this direction going on in that ITER program, right? The thermonuclear fusion power in the south of France.
People can look this up at iter.org.
You get the idea, right? These are the sorts of things that the worldwide class, political working class for itself, would be interested in promoting. In other words, human progress, an agency that would be adequate for human progress. But that also then comes down to a minimum wage for fast food workers, or stopping foreclosures, or guaranteeing that people can get either a free education or a 0% student loan, and a series of things like this, because all of those are concrete mediations. The alternative is what? The alternative to class consciousness is false consciousness. Among the most pernicious kinds of false consciousness are localism, particularism, local chauvinism, and indeed the small nation chauvinism. Right? I don't want to beat up on Luxembourg and Belgium again, but if you were a complete, Luxembourg fanatic, right? Well, then you've sort of got the rest of the world against you. And in particular, questions that leftists used to be interested in, right? Alienation and fetishism. You look at the working class or working people as they are today empirically, right? What you find is that they're fragmented, they're manipulated, they're chock full of enemy ideology, they've been manipulated by psychological operations, right? PSYOPs, MK operations, mind control operations by intelligence agencies, and they're in just a confused, pragmatic, fragmented situation, which means they don't get the work done, right? They're impotent, right? They're an easy mark for the ruling class, especially around the question of money. Money is one of the main focuses of human alienation and fetishism. The idea being, you hear people say, well, our country doesn't have enough money to do that. Well, of course, any central banker knows you can print all the money you want. You can generate unlimited amounts of credit anytime you want if you're a central bank, at least within certain limits. What you're really saying, if you don't have the economic power to do it, you're really saying we don't have enough human labor of the right kind and the right number to do that. So what has happened is the productive power of mankind has been stripped away from the individual person or group, and it's been projected onto what? Gold, Bitcoin, or the dollar, the euro, whatever it is. And money, of course, it's a necessary mediation, and I'm not recommending an economy without money, but you have to remember what it is, right? Money is simply a political fiction. It's a way to distribute things, and it's a way to move productive resources. The other way to do it, of course, is a planned economy, right? You can have a state planning agency that does it, and you can even do it without money. But that has been tried, and that is not as effective as using money in a political way to get things done. But that's a kind of fetishism. So if people tell you, we don't have the money for that, well, what you're really talking about is labor power. So manpower, or human labor, I guess, in a more modern way to put it. So now, if that's some idea of what you're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. If that's understandable, what's wrong with the competing methods? And let me just say, as a preface to all this stuff, the idea of secessionism, or breaking up the levels of national unity that have been attained so far, right? 19th century was a great time, right? The U.S. consolidated as a nation state, Canada, Italy, Germany, you go around the world, right? Switzerland, all kinds of places emerged as nation states. The idea that you would break those up is an extremely reactionary and dangerous idea. And indeed, this is the main policy of the CIA, MI6, the other intelligence agencies, right? Because on the road to constituting the political working class for itself, who do you find opposing you? You find the bankers, of course, but you find their political operatives out in the open, right? Democratic and Republican political leaders, but you've also got these agencies that operate in a covert way. So we have the Scottish referendum, right? This is a very good example. What you have to understand is the smaller the unit, the more reactionary the unit is likely to be. And this is what these local control guys don't understand. What is being proposed in the Scottish referendum is not the independence of Scotland by any stretch of the imagination. What is being proposed is a form of local control. You can compare it to, we'll leave the comparisons aside because they might lead us away. But with the Scottish referendum, what you're going to get is a Bantustan. You may remember in the last decades of South Africa, right, the white minority government, in order to maintain itself, organized these self-governing enclaves or entities where black populations, like KwaZulu of the Zulus was a famous one, black population would be allowed to essentially police itself, while the big issues of national finance, national defense, foreign policy, all of that stayed with the government there in Pretoria. In the case of Scotland, what you're going to get is a Bantustan, in other words, a local control entity, an enclave, which will have the British Queen as the head of state. They will continue to use the British pound, controlled by the Bank of England. They will remain, according to what they've said, as parts of NATO, of the International Monetary Fund, and they will be subject to the European Commission and the entire body of Brussels law, right, which the Eurogarchs and Eurocrats have inflicted. So what you can see there, that's not independence. That's a fraud. It's simply a counterinsurgency. In other words, it's saying, we don't want you to fight the banks. We don't want you to go out and impose taxation and break the power of the City of London and the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyd's Bank and the rest of these things. So we're going to give you this, right? We're going to use this as a kind of a diversion. I would like to congratulate George Galloway of the Respect Party of Great Britain, who is Scottish, who made a very good statement about this, saying the principal determinant in human affairs is class. It is not nationality. Class trumps everything. Class trumps race, nationality. It doesn't matter. Class is fundamental, provided you understand it in the broad Plato-Machiavelli sense that I said before. The people who are supporting this fake referendum include our old nemesis, Noam Chomsky, right? The philodoxer of Cambridge, somehow always finding himself on the CIA side of everything, be it the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, and now the Scottish referendum. Noam is there to lead you precisely in the wrong direction. I urge people to vote no, and to do so with the great scorn. The other thing about it is, this will be a kind of a barometer of how crazy British intelligence really is, because this is insane, right? Scottish independence is a piece of insanity. If they go through with it, it means that they are willing to do just about anything. I would point out that in the summer of 1914, in July 1914, right, between Sarajevo and the shooting starting, the main political issue in Great Britain was not should there be World War I, although that was going on in the background. The main thing that people could see was, should Ireland have home rule? What's being proposed for Scotland is really a kind of home rule. This almost led to a civil war, right? Because the Ulster men of Northern Ireland did not want this. It was going to be home rule for the Catholic Southern Irish counties. And this also, it almost led to a civil war in Great Britain. So again, if you think about the First World War, 1914, the British are tampering with their counterinsurgency structure. And now again, right, does this mean that the British intelligence is crazy enough to start World War III? I mean, they could start. They have nuclear weapons. They can start World War III anytime they want. The other thing, which I think is more likely, a worldwide orgy of secessionism and chaos. That's what they're going to have, right? You can see there's a bunch of kooks around Venice who are talking about the independence of Venice. There's a bunch of Catalonians, right? You got to remember, Iberian Peninsula, the British have been fomenting independence movements against Spain since time immemorial, right? Since Charles V and Philip II in the 1500s. So the Catalonians, right, praised by George Orwell, the Catalonians are up. And then, of course, our Confederates and neo-Confederates, racists, white supremacists, and all the rest, right? The Cloven Bundy set will be coming out, right, with full program. And if Scotland can do it, we can do it. And I'm afraid on this stuff, the Russians are useless, because the Russian propaganda, they think, unfortunately, this is one of the weaknesses of Russian thinking. The Russians are pushovers for analogies. And especially if it's an analogy of a foreign event with a Russian event, or more or less Russian event, they'll say now, Crimea seceded from Ukraine and joined Russia. Therefore, Russia has to defend secessionism wherever it comes up. Don't do it. It's a mistake. This is a terrible, terrible weakness. The Chinese, at this moment, the Chinese are better off, because the Chinese say no secessionism ever. No splitism. That's actually a better position, Because the Chinese say, we don't like secessionism because we're afraid it's going to happen in Tibet or in Xinjiang, right, in Chinese Turkestan or in Manchuria or God knows where, right? They don't like it. So good. Go with the Chinese on this one because the Russians are not going to, they're not going to get it right. That's, I think, essentially the Scottish referendum. And again, it shows how far gone the world is. You're going to see all of these secessionist vermin come crawling and creeping out of their despicable caverns and holes and say, well, if the Scots could do it. Because it's basically a symbol that the British want to go ahead and break up the nation state. Got to remember, the British use Britain as a show window for the policies they wish to inflict on the world, right? The most recent famous case is Margaret Thatcher and her primitive, cruel, asset-stripping, anti-development economics. They put her in there in Britain, and then they used that as an export product to inflict stupid Reagan and Reaganomics on the U.S., right? All that stuff was essentially pioneered by Thatcher. So that's what they're doing. So I would say to the Scots, don't let MI6 do another experiment on your flesh, because you're going to be the losers, right? This is going to be a bad, bad deal.
In America, on the right, we have this move for secessionism, and on the left, we have localism.
Yeah, we have localism.
Yeah. The end result is the same. There's this popular idea among activists that the era of work is over. We often get this. And people like the After Party are suggesting a mandatory minimum income. And I was wondering if you think this is British intelligence to usher in neo-feudalism.
Sure. Here's the problem, and this is what leftists generally have a hard time with, is that before you can have distributive justice, right, before you can distribute things, wealth has to be produced. First produce wealth, then think about how you're going to distribute it. And I am absolutely in favor of distributive justice, but this is no way to approach the problem. Production, the massive increase of production in all areas of life, and especially the modernization of infrastructure, right? If you don't have that, you're simply talking through your hat. Let's go to one of the leading fakers on the scene, of course, Beppe Grillo of the so-called Five-Star Party of Italy. He's a washed-up, no-talent comedian who has been talking about precisely this, right, that work is over and that there should be a guaranteed annual income. The problem is he doesn't do anything about this. It's very interesting. Grillo's party got about 25% in the Italian elections back in February of the previous year, 2013. So he got into power. You know, he got a significant number of deputies and senators, and even regions that he controls. What has he been able to do, especially at the national level? Nothing. Mm-hmm. Because, like Hitler, Grillo's position is he will not join any government unless he's the prime minister, and everybody's got to keep giving him votes of confidence. He is now largely discredited. You have to also look behind these things. Like, where does this come from? Is this a spontaneous growth? Well, you may be interested to know that Grillo was endorsed by Goldman Sachs, the same Goldman Sachs executive, a real pig, who coined the term pigs, right? Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. That same guy went on record before the Italian election of February 2013 saying, Grillo is the man. The U.S. Embassy, the U.S. ambassador over there, Thorne, a close friend of John Kerry, right? Both of them skull and bones at Yale, also endorsed Grillo. So does this sound radical, dear friends, right? I think even...
Well, Michael White, the chair of the After Party, works with Beppe Grillo in this.
He attended the Waffa Day.
Right.
He attended the latest Waffa Day in Genoa last winter, right? So this is an international cartel of fraud. And with Grillo, here's the problem with Grillo right now. Grillo is a sock puppet. Grillo is simply a comedian who reads his lines. He doesn't write his lines. There are some comedians, I think, you know better than I do, who actually write their lines. But Grillo is not one of those. He's got to get it written for him. And the guy who does the writing for him is this guy, Casaleggio. Casaleggio, he was part of this Casaleggio Associates. One of his colleagues there was a guy called Sasson. And this Sasson was a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Italy. In other words, a colonial, imperial entity, right? Something which is up to its neck in the strategy of tension and all kinds of other things in Italy. Ultimately, also with the Aspen Institute behind that, according to some Italian writers, the Bilderberg Group. So the Bilderberg Group, Aspen, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce influences on this Casaleggio operation, which writes the lines for Grillo. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that radical, dear followers out there? Casaleggio is now sick, so he cannot continue to write all the lines for Grillo. And there is a crisis now in the Grillo movement because this sock puppet is taking over.
Why Grillo, though? He's such an unappealing character. How did he get?
Yeah, he's sort of an anti-hero, right? You think about Italy, right? Italy, glamour,
yeah,
beauty, class, right? And here this frumpy, hairy, ugly guy. I think it's to degrade Italy. You know, it was often written that the average German had an idea that Hitler was personally repulsive, and that just putting Hitler in power was already a step towards degrading the German people and breaking their spirit. The idea that you get Grillo on television all the time as a great authority, right? It's a degradation. The Italian brand in the world, right? What are you going to sell? You got to, design, beauty, class, right? And then, the face of all that is going to be Grillo. Take a look at one of his...
Yeah, if anybody doesn't know who he is, please Google him on Google Images. But he wears a baseball cap on stage to make his speeches next to other candidates in suits and ties, unshaven with a T-shirt with sauce on it. It's unbelievable. Yeah. It's very strange.
Could we say more generally, though, that maybe the appeal to some of this stuff is pessimism or is defeatism, whether you're talking about secession or whether you're talking about, this local rule or home rule? It's that people are giving up on the possibility of ending globalization, or they're giving up on trying to reform the EU, and so they're just trying to appeal to that impulse in people to just give up, do something as local as possible, and just stop fighting.
I would just say the way most people are going to see it is not at this level of abstraction. Most people would not say, let's go out today and try to end globalism. But the idea is, I don't see any progress in my life. Economic conditions are deteriorating, cultural conditions more and more barbaric. The society doesn't go anywhere, right? If the U.S. had taken the $700 billion of the Obama stimulus and built a large maglev railway system, right? We've now got a Japanese company, of all things, coming to say, we're going to build a maglev from Washington to Baltimore so Americans can see it and know that there's something better, and then that will generate demand for our Japanese technology of the maglev. So the average person, they've been down so long, they don't know what up is. They don't know what to fight for. The Grillo people are highly alienated, right? People whose personal associations are minimal, who spend a lot of time as computer programmers and things like this. And Grillo then kept them atomized. That's the other thing. Grillo never had a party congress. He never created locals, right? An Italian party used to have, in Rome, right, the Italian communists with a section in every neighborhood, a local office in every neighborhood, and then they'd have a city federation, and then they'd be there at the province, at the region, nationally, right, internet. With Grillo, there's none of that, right? They're only sitting there in their isolation, voting, allegedly, on things through his website, and nobody knows who's voting, and nobody knows how he's fixing the vote. And then, of course, he's a loser, right? In the European election a couple of months ago, Grillo gets out there and he says, okay, gang, we're going to win big. We're going to take it all. I'm going to become prime minister. We're going to get more than 50%. And then, of course, and Italians, if you don't, you should go to hell. And he lost. He lost 5%. I compared this to Hitler, of course, in 1932, right? Hitler did very well in the elections in the spring of 1932, but by November 1932, Hitler also, the Nazis suffered losses in that November election, right, which made a lot of bankers scared because they thought the movement would collapse. So I think certainly with all the stuff that I'm saying, Grillo is on his way towards collapsing. And remember, the thing that he's built around perhaps more than anything is no infrastructure, no great projects. Don't build railroads. Don't build electrical grids, right? Don't build the bridge from Calabria to Sicily to Tunisia. Don't do all the obvious things. In other words, if we look at this from our point of view, right, Franklin D. Roosevelt, WPA, PWA, TVA, the way you get out of a depression is huge public works. Grillo is the opposite. He says, no, never.
We're still living on that infrastructure.
Sure. This is the alienation. In other words, you get people who are proposing things that will lead to their own death or their own immiseration, maybe, and they're incapable of seeing it in cause and effect, right? This is false consciousness, right? You could have adventures in false consciousness with Beppe Grillo, and let's dive into the slough of despond and alienation and fetishism with Grillo. The other thing about Grillo, like the fascists, it's all an attack on politicians. That politicians are corrupt, politicians steal money, politicians live better than you on your tax money, and who gets a free ride much of the time?
The bankers.
The bankers. The real enemy disappears from the Grillo narrative. In Italy in the late 1940s, there was something called the uomo qualunque of a comedian, Giannettini. Giannettini was a vulgar, banal comedian, just like Grillo, and his thing was the uomo qualunque, the man in the street, the average guy. Right? That was one. And then we have in France, we have the famous movement of shopkeepers and little tradesmen, which is Poujadisme. Poujade of France is the other example. And then, again, you have to remember that of the Nazi voters, say in Germany in 1932, it's the immiserated middle class who provide a large, large number, because these are people who they have some kind of class pretension. They don't want to precipitate into the proletariat, right? They don't want to face the fact, well, I have no property, I might as well join a union or, do something about this. No, I have to be respectable. I got to hide the fact that I'm so poor, right? This kind of thing.
Well, what's the difference between the trend for workplace democracy versus a strong union?
Well, it's a counterinsurgency, right? Mm-hmm. Here, I'm afraid we have to mention a specific person, right? Richard Wolff.
Yes.
Wolff, I think, taught at the University of Massachusetts, and he now appears at the Left Forum here as a kind of a pundit. Now, what he talks about is workers' self-management. The democratization of the workplace is another version of this. Traditionally, it's been called autogestion. Right? That's the French word, autogestion. The gestion means management, so self-gestion management, right? Mm-hmm. This has been tried. This is in particular, theoreticians push this who come from areas that are backward in their capitalist development. In other words, Spain. Right? Spain is with very small industrialization, right? Compared to Germany, northern France, England, right? Spain is way, way behind. So when you have workers who have been peasants recently, who were born as peasants, grew up as peasants, and come into the city, they don't like the hierarchy of the factory. They don't like being in a city when you get right down to it, right? There's always an explosive social potential when you get irritable peasants who have come into a big city. I saw this years ago in Turin, Italy. You'd get peasants from Sardinia coming to work in the Fiat plant, right? So here we are, Fiat Mirafiori, biggest factory in Europe, and a little peasant from Sardinia comes in there. He feels small. He doesn't like it. And this is when people turn to the snake oil salesman here, and this brings us back to Richard Wolff. So workers' self-management. I try to point out why this is a failure. I'm going to give you one of his examples. But in particular, I think he's not honest in the way that he presents it, because if you look at his website, and I hope you can confirm this because I did this the other day again, he never mentions that workers' self-management was applied in Yugoslavia between the 1940s and the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And I would argue that workers' self-management was a very important part of the breakup of the country in this way. Under Marshal Tito was, of course, a dictator, communist. They had this workers' self-management, the autogestion going on, in an area which, of course, had been backward, right? Again, it's not the Ruhr, it's not Manchester, it's not northern France or anything like this. It's backward. So a lot of peasants, and they, appealed this idea of the self-management. Once Tito had died and the dictatorship blew apart, right, with the collapse of the Soviets and nearby regimes, the country flew apart. In other words, everything then became a very ugly kind of nationalism, right? Murderous national feuds came to the fore. And what you see then is that they'd been so focused on their little local factory that the idea of a nation had gone out the window, right? Or the idea of, larger forms of cooperation, Yugoslavia, had gone out the window, right? There was nobody was willing to fight for Yugoslavia, right? Once this had all ended. Now, specifically, the one example, that's the example Wolff does not give.
If you go to his website, rdwolff.com, there's a search bar there. If you put the word Yugoslavia in the search bar, you'll never find anything about Yugoslavia.
Yeah, which I think if you go to I've been checking the Wikipedia pages. If you look up this autogestion self-management, they do give you some examples of where they claim this has been tried, right? So they at least put Yugoslavia on there, but Wolff does not. So this is why I say, maybe mixing the metaphor a little bit, he's not the Cadillac of left-wing economists. He's the Yugo of left-wing economists. Yugo, of course, being a not-so-great car. It was a third-hand knockoff of a Fiat 124 from Italy. So this was not a great car. So he's the Yugo of economists. Now, the example...
And Noam Chomsky's in the passenger seat of the Yugo because he's right... He's right there with it. He calls it anarcho-syndicalism.
Yes, anarcho-syndicalism.
He does refer to autogestion.
That's exactly what it is. Anarcho-syndicalism. And again, you find this especially in Southern Europe and especially among people who are peasants. Now, the idea that we here in the United States should attempt to revert to an anarcho-syndicalist mentality, I think this would be awful. You're right. Noam Chomsky is riding shotgun in the Yugo with Richard Wolff.
Well, these guys like Noam Chomsky, Gar, Alperovitz, and Richard Wolff always say the same cliches that Washington is broken or the workplace is broken, and the main issue is forming the concept of capitalism. But you're also going to hear Washington is broken, that language you're going to hear out of the mouths of the Koch-funded candidates like Ben Sass, who were fighting in Nebraska. They never take aim at Wall Street.
All Wall Street politicians say that the government is broken.
Right, Washington.
My answer to that is Wall Street is broken. The government would be okay, but Wall Street is broken, and it's sucking in all the...
Well, that's the same thesis of Richard Wolff and Noam Chomsky. Washington is broken.
Yeah. Let's focus on Wall Street, gang. Huh? That's, again, it's just like with Grillo, right? Where's the attack on the bankers, and not just a verbal attack, but where's the proposal to hit them in the labanza, right? To cut them down to size, to tax them, to regulate them, and make sure that it's a way that's going to help people. Richard Wolff is a great troubadour of the phrases of something called Mondragon in Spain. Now, Mondragon is what? Mondragon is a town in the Basque country. So it means northeast Spain, near the French border, right? Near Bayonne, Hendaye, these places, right? The Basques, right? So this of course, has been the location of this ETA, right? Harry Batasuna, the independence movement of the Basques, need I say, sponsored by the British from time immemorial. British not necessarily doing a whole lot with it directly today. We don't know, right? You don't hear much about this, but just that's where it came from. So Mondragon is also a company. And Mondragon is, they have several thousand employees. And this is supposedly an example of a self-managed entity, right? It's an autogestion company. Now, I would just like to cite a scholarly study here. The only scholarly study in English is called The Myth of Mondragon, Cooperatives, Politics, and Working Class Life in a Basque Town by Sharon Kasmir. It's SharrynKasmir. Now, this lady is the professor. I think she teaches in the New York SUNY State University of New York system. I'll check that. This is somebody who went into it with the idea that the self-management system, and she started her research, right, is the answer to the predicament of modern humanity. And her finding is that it's not. In particular, she points out the workers of Mondragon are more passive, more apathetic, more listless, less mobilized than workers in similar companies in similar places who have a union and there's a clash, right? In other words, there's management and there's a union and they fight. At least sometimes they fight. You know, when the contract comes due or to get a contract, they have to fight, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas at Mondragon, they have these factory councils, which are management and labor together, supposedly discussing what's going to be done. But as this lady Kasmir, Professor Kasmir points out, the management methods at Mondragon are not materially different from other similar companies that are supposedly, old-style capitalists. They still operate, say, under the European Central Bank, under the European Commission, under the euro, right? Spain has had this terrible economic collapse. This self-management has not made any difference. And indeed, one of the big parts of Mondragon has just gone bankrupt in the last 6 or 9 months. And this is called Fagor, F-A-G-O-R. Fagor was the kitchen appliance division of Mondragon. And it went bankrupt, and it has now been liquidated. And that's a couple of thousand jobs that are kaput. They're gone. And the interesting thing was there were demonstrations in Mondragon by the workers of Fagor, in other words, part of this conglomerate, self-managed. The Fagor people were there saying, hey, Mondragon executives, save us, merge with us, arrange us a loan, do something. And the answer was nix. There was no help for them. So what does this say, right? Is that working class solidarity? Is that the best we can do? Does that seem to be leading the world out of anything? I would urge people, take a look at this Myth of Mondragon by Sharon Kasmir, and you will see the inherent bankruptcy of what Richard Wolff is proposing. And again, he won't tell you about the Yugoslav experience. The Yugoslav experience is that widespread adoption of the worker self-management method leads to a bloodbath, to a civil war with horrible atrocities, concentration camps. Now, that probably wouldn't happen everywhere, right? This was superimposed on a, mosaic of already existing ethnic conflict. But certainly this is no model. And then there's Mondragon. That looks like a failure. I believe Professor Wolff is associated with the praise of the Legge Marcora. This is extremely obscure, so you have to bear with me. Now, here we are in Italy in the 1970s, and there was an Italian politician by the name of Marcora, and this is a funny coincidence because I knew Marcora. What I was trying to do was, along with the political movement I was in at the time, was to organize Italy to declare a debt moratorium and escape from the International Monetary Fund system. And on this basis, I went to see the guy who was at that time the Italian agriculture minister, Giovanni Marcora, M-A-R-C-O-R-A, and he was not willing to do anything for this. But it turned out that in 1972, this same Marcora he had sponsored a law which goes something like this. If you have, I believe it's 10 unemployed people if they get together and form a kind of consortium, they can ask the unemployment office to pay them their benefits for a year in advance, with the idea that they're going to form a business which would presumably be self-managed. And I have been trying, since I saw this a couple of weeks ago, I've been trying to find out, has this had any effect? In other words, has this led to self-managed businesses? How many people have taken advantage of this, right? How many of them survived, right? Because, it's the hardest thing to do is to start a business, right? A lot of them fail. The main thing is that the decline of the Italian economy since then has been huge. In other words, if you just look at the last 10 years, Italy has declined relative to its previous levels as much or perhaps more than any other European economy, right? That's the despair. The despair that gave birth to Grillo is precisely this, right? That there's economic degradation. So I think I'm on firm ground in saying that the Legge Marcora has had absolutely no effect in propping up the Italian economy or slowing the rate of depression or anything of the kind. And this guy, at the time, he was so... I don't want to go into his agricultural policies. The word was that his agricultural policies were based on manure, but we used to call him Ma Porca. He's not Marcora, but Ma Porca. Unfortunately, he died some years ago. But this is not a good guy. This is not a good law. I don't see how you can come forward seriously with this stuff. So, again, suffice it to say, this local organization, this self-management, this is the opposite of class-wide, right? This creates local chauvinism of the most extreme kind, not that kind of nationwide, class-wide vision that you're going to need, and indeed a worldwide vision. And again, if you're in Europe, you can forget nation by nation. That's just gone. That was gone 50 years ago even, but it's even more gone now. And here in the U.S., you got, if you don't have some idea of Europe and some idea of Japan, at the very least, you're going to go nowhere.
Webster, we did a show a while ago about the Situationist International, and I think they had some similar ideas to these other guys.
Grillo is from that. Grillo is from Genoa. I tried to delve into this because I had known some people in Genoa in the 1970s that seemed to be close to Grillo, but he's a product of that general milieu.
Adbusters and Occupy came out of the Situationist International. The Situationist International in France used to call their happenings or occupations. It was a direct mimic of the Situationist International, which was all this anti-middle class stuff and had no real program. It was just destruction and anarchy.
A bunch of washed-up, no-talent poetasters and fakers, right? The two that you need to know. Raoul Van Agem was one, and then Guy Debord. One of these two just died a couple of years ago. It's tinged with a kind of pornographic view of life, but it's obsessed with advertising and communication. And it imagines that by operating solely in the realm of a kind of cultural criticism within the cliches of... what can we say, oligarchical, ruling class, banker-dominated ideology, right, or advertising, discourse, as they say, right? They say discourse. You told me about this Gallegos. Let's talk about Gallegos, the after party, okay? Mm-hmm. So among the American analogs or admirers of Grillo and all of his degradation, we have this after party, right? And, of course, I understand that they envy us, right? That the Tax Wall Street Party and the United Front Against Austerity, we fight, we have demands, we have candidates, right? Mm-hmm. Remember, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It's very good advice, much better than these situationist fakers. But now, Gallegos, I found this was just pathetic. This was the petty bourgeois vision in its pure form, right? The petty bourgeois... Again, this means the old petty bourgeoisie would be a lawyer, a doctor, an editor, somebody sort of in the middle, not a huge industrialist, not a factory worker, not a farmer, but sort of in the middle. The petty bourgeois wants the banks and the big corporations to get along with the workers, right? They don't want to be caught in the middle of strikes. They want social peace on the basis of what they call a kind of a compromise program. Except when you look at the compromise program reflects the interests of the petty bourgeoisie. And now, because of the atrophy of production in our society, the petty bourgeoisie is quite large. The New Deal created a middle class, which was the numerical majority of the whole society. But a lot of them have now become non-productive. And when you're non-productive, there's a danger you're going to become, parasitical. So here's what Gallego says. He wants the political parties to cooperate. Can't we please get along? And then he says, don't get sucked into politics. My God, we're here to do politics. And he says, remember, the rule always was keep religion and politics out of it. He actually says this. No religion, no politics.
Just so the audience knows, guys.
Only business. You got to do it as a business. Well, that was Romney, right? Romney said, elect me, I'll run this place like a business. And man, that would have been something.
It's just so the audience knows, Jeff Gallegos is the one candidate that the After Party has, and you can find his...
And he's not a candidate. He says, I'm not on the ballot. I'm not going to try to get on the ballot. I have no relation. He's just somebody they put up there to say, guess what, I'm a candidate, right? I think he's a candidate for some other...
On YouTube, under the After Party's propaganda pitches, they say, check out the Tax Wall Street Party. They actually have candidates.
You talked earlier about Micah White, who is the guy that went and spoke at the Vafa Day or Vafa Fest. His big dream was he's going to move to this rural town in coastal Oregon and basically take over the town and run, community soup kitchens and all this stuff. And I guess that didn't work out because you never heard of it again. But just these people, they seem to have money and support, but their ideas are just absurd. I can't imagine anybody being attracted to this stuff, but it's kind of thrown out there to just dispirit anyone who might want to get re-involved in whatever Occupy Wall Street.
Well, in this great time of economic crisis, their number one platform point is indigenous rights. And every indigenous person that I've ever met wants the same opportunities as an educated white person in America.
A standard of living.
Yes.
So their kids can grow up and take their place in the workforce in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty elementary. Right? What are you going to want? Are you going to live in a tent? That won't do. Living in a tent, it's not possible, because living in a tent means your kids are going to have a cultural level appropriate to a tent, and they're going to be unemployable. So there we go, right? Nice to do it for a couple of weeks in the summer if you can. This cannot be the thing. The analog to this anarcho-syndicalist, local control, autogestion, Hugo, Richard Wolff, Mondragon, Fagor, the form in which people in the United States may know this is Saul Alinsky, right? So here we have this. I would say it's fair to say Hillary Clinton studied it, but had the sense to say, this is not my cup of tea because it doesn't work. That's the big thing about Saul Alinsky. Of course, Obama, he is a product of this, right, for the various foundations that he worked for as a community. Now, what is this stuff? You have to remember, Saul Alinsky is a reactionary. Saul Alinsky is what? He hates unions. He hates Roosevelt. So he wants to organize poor people in neighborhoods to have these micro struggles against who? Not against the big corporations usually, but against the mayor, the city council, elected officials. Right? So it's the same old trash. And he did this in Chicago, right? Rules for Radicals. Rules for Radicals has been keeping Limbaugh and Hannity and these people going low these last 5 or 6 years since Obama's been around. And it's a fraud. And the big fraud with Alinsky is, he's of course no longer with us, but when have you ever won anything? What demands have you won? The idea of this stuff as counterinsurgency, as a way to demoralize you, to disorient you, to sink you in despair, something highly relevant, right? As the years go by, these Saul Alinsky local control groups, right? You got to remember, some of them come from Newark, New Jersey in the mid-1960s with Tom Hayden of the Students for a Democratic Society. In other words, local control has been around for a long time because foundations were willing to fund it, right? And the CIA ultimately was willing to fund it because that's That's counterinsurgency. But
Webster,
nothing ever happens. You never win any demands. So eventually what happens, you get old, you die. If you make any money, you go to the suburbs, you drop out. So it means that all of those people are on the path to ride off into the sunset and never be heard from again. So don't do it. Don't join it.
Webster, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us and helping us sort out the confusion. And maybe we can continue this. You've been listening to
vote no. If you're in Scotland and you hear this, vote no. And don't vote for Grillo. Grillo is a has-been. He's actually a never was.
You've been listening to United Front Radio at ucy.tv/UFR. Have a blessed evening. Thank you, Webster.
We're sitting down with Michael Scheuer, the man who had served in the CIA for more than 2 years, up until 2004. At one time, he was the chief of the CIA Bin Laden unit. Then he went and exposed how counter-effective Washington's methods were in the fight against terror. He looked at the U.S. through its enemy's eyes. In fact, it's the title of one of his books called Through Our Enemy's Eyes. I'm very pleased to have the chance to interview you, Mr. Scheuer.
I'm glad to be here.
Bin Laden is gone. Who is Washington's number one enemy now?
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting an Islamic enemy that Washington believes is out to kill us because we have elections, because we're free, because we have women in the workplace. It's an enemy that doesn't exist. It didn't exist when Bin Laden was alive. It doesn't exist now. America is being attacked because of its foreign policy in the Muslim world, because of its support for Israel, because of its support for the Saudi police state, because of its presence on the Arab Peninsula. And until we accept that, until Americans can say to each other, whether you support aid to Israel or not, our relationship with Israel is causing this war, we are not going to be able to defeat this enemy. And Israel itself as a country is not the problem. The real problem is the leaders of the Jewish American community in the United States who influence and corrupt our Congress to support Israel when we have no interest there.
You imply that the Israeli lobby is dragging the United States into the wars, into the conflict?
They're absolutely dragging us in.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia."